So please join me in welcoming and applauding a great scholar and a great teacher of mine.
Okay, so Ahmed spoke at a very, very high level of abstraction, which is usually where he's most comfortable. And so what I want to try to do is talk a little bit about Islamic jurisprudence and make it, and put it in the kind of frame that he is interested in talking about, namely the idea about the universal and particular and human reason, and how does this work itself out in various domains of Islamic jurisprudence. Okay, so I think the first question that we want to talk about is what is a rule in Islamic law? Is this good? Does it sound good? Okay. So typically we might have different words that you might have come across. I'm going to use the whiteboard. You might have seen words like hukm, for example. Sorry. Hukm, right? Ma hukm shay. What's the rule governing something, right? Now hukm itself is a kind of equivocal term because the hukm might be kulli and it might be juz'i. Okay? So kulli means universal. Yeah, I'm going to use a different pen now. So when I say kulli, right, it means a universal rule. يعني مثلا الصلاة تجب على كل مكلف. So prayer is obligatory for every subject of the law, right? So that's a universal rule. Okay, هذا حكم كلي. On the other hand, I could say this car belongs to Khalid. Okay, so this is now a hukm juz'i. It's a ruling regarding a particular set of facts. Okay, so I want to avoid using this term hukm because it is so ambiguous. So what I'll start off with then is talk about something called a fatwa. Because a fatwa, right, at least among the later jurists, right, a fatwa is restricted to qa'ada kulliya, a universal rule, okay, and it's derived from something known as a dalil, okay, and this dalil, by its nature, is kulli, meaning that the dalil, the evidence, or the evidences, adillah, that support the qa'ada, right, aren't relevant to just one case, but they're relevant to a potential infinite number of cases, right? So when the mufti says, well, you shouldn't say it, when the mufti says every prayer requires the worshipper to face the Kaaba, okay, this is a rule that covers an infinite number of prayers, or infinite number of individuals that are going to pray, right? Okay, and it's a universal rule. Okay. Now, the problem with fatwas, well, there are a couple of problems with fatwas. First of all, a fatwa by definition, insofar as it's derived from a dalil through reasoning, istidlal, right? We're not really sure if we can say with certainty that it is actually the rule of God. Okay? So I'm not somebody who does set theory, so I don't know the proper notation, so I'm sure there's some kind of thing that would indicate it. But the fatwa is, we can say, it's more likely than not hukmullah. That's what it means. It does not mean equal It's not this. Okay, it's not a relationship of equality because the fatwa has an element of subjectivity. It has an objective aspect. It has the universal indicant, which produces the rule, but it's interpreted by a particular human being known as the mujtahid, right? And so we have an issue now of trying to understand what impact does the mujtahid have on the quality of the conclusion. Okay? Now, I'm leaving aside for the moment certain rules that they claim are not derived through a reasoning process, that they imprint themselves necessarily on your mind as a Muslim. But these are very, very abstract rules. Okay? Things like it's obligatory to pray, obligatory to fast. They're at such a level of abstraction that you can't actually adhere to them. Because once you actually want to operationalize them, then you require this kind of reasoning and inference that gives it sort of flesh and structure. And now you get back to this problem of attribution of this to God. Okay? So, in principle, though, what a mufti is trying to do is trying to communicate a general universal rule. And it's expressed as a universal. We, as recipients of the fatwa, we confront it as a proposition. Like, A is X. Well, I could say, just based on the logical structure of that sentence, I say, no, A is not X. Okay? So a fatwa, from the perspective of the response of a rational person, right, demands what the jurists say, tasdiq or takdib. Tasdiq means you affirm it, so you might say yes, A is X. That's tasdiq. Or you might say A is not X. That's takdib, you reject it. Okay? Now, as this sort of happened through the history of jurisprudence as time moves on, jurists, the dominant position among the theologians is that the opinion of a mujtahid is dhanni, meaning we attribute it to God in a probabilistic way, not in a certain way. Okay? And that means that it's up to the recipient, the mustafti, to do tasdiq or takdib. Okay? But, this is very important, there is a meta rule of Islamic ethics in which they claim that God said the following, that in every case in which there is no express rule, i.e. no nas. Now, I want to say something here. We moderns use nas in a very promiscuous way. When we say nas, we mean anything written down. That's not what nas means as a term, as a technical term in Islamic jurisprudence and theology. Nas means an unequivocal statement, an explicit statement that does not admit of more than one meaning. Okay? So that's very, very few dalils, according to the jurists, qualify as nas. Okay, so nas is not everything that's reported about the Prophet ﷺ, nor everything that's in the Quran. It's not the way we use nas in modern Arabic, anything printed. Right? Nas means a communication, a communicative act that admits of only one interpretation, a univocal interpretation. Right? So in theory, the only thing that would undermine our confidence about nas is if it were abrogated. But it only admits of one meaning. Okay? Everything otherwise is zahir. There's an apparent sense to it. And so because we assume God adopts the rules of a rational speaker, we can trust the zahir. We can trust it, at least in a prima facie sense. So we take the zahir, the apparent sense of a dalil, to be its intended meaning, unless we can show there's a reason to depart from it. Metaphor, for example. Okay? I don't want to get too far down into these sort of things. But here the point is that because the fatwa is dhanni, the individual has to make a decision whether or not to believe it or not. But behind all of that, there's a meta-ethical rule according to the mutakallimun that says the following, that God told us that for everything in which there is no nas, you are commanded to engage in ijtihad, in reasoning, by comparing that for which there is no nas to that for which there is a nas. In other words, you're supposed to you have a moral obligation. You can think of the meta rule of ethical duty in Islam to be the following: that for everything which you encounter in which you don't have an express instruction from God, which is most things, your duty is to compare it to what you do know God has taught you. And then you think about it rationally, doing ijtihad, and whatever that conclusion is, that is God's rule for you. Okay? So in other words, ما ذهب إليه المجتهد فهو حكم الله بالنسبة له. Okay? So whatever conclusion mujtahid arrives at, that is God's rule for him. Not because, well, I mean, now there's another dispute about the ontology of that conclusion, which I'm going to get to in a second. The theologians have different accounts for why this is a duty, but everybody agrees, regardless of their madhab, about ijtihad, that if whatever the mujtahid concludes, that is hukmullah, that is God's rule for him for that case, and for all the people who adopt him as an authority, i.e. muqallid. Because the assumption is, of course, not everyone is capable of doing ijtihad. If we're not capable of doing ijtihad, then we do taqlid, we defer. So, if I'm a muqallid of Shafi'i, whatever Shafi'i's view on a certain subject is, that's what God obliges Shafi'i to follow. And I am obliged to follow that rule by virtue of me being a follower of Shafi'i. Okay? So that's how moral obligation is generated through this idea of the duty to practice ijtihad. Many ways in the modern world, we think of ijtihad as a right. Oh, bab al-ijtihad maftuh, taqlid, that's such a bad thing, etc., etc. Everybody should have the right to engage in interpretation, blah, 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 blah. But in fact, in Sunni moral thought, ethical thought, ijtihad is a duty. That's what distinguishes it from other understandings. Other schools of Islamic law rejected ijtihad. Okay, so for example, the early Shia rejected ijtihad because they said there's an imam for that. Right? Because they said, look, what's this ijtihad nonsense? Ijtihad is not going to give you haqq. Right? And it must be that God gave us haqq, and that haqq is in the form of an imam. And so you should follow the imam and not engage in ijtihad. Likewise, the Zahiris. People have heard of the Zahiris? That's their same view. They say, ijtihad, that's nonsense. Ijtihad opens the door for subjective opinion. Okay, so far from ijtihad being a duty, it's a sin. What you should do is just follow the zahir of the text. And so they attempt to develop rules of ta'wil in such a way that everything is covered through lots of different interpretive assumptions. Anyway, I don't want to go through all of that. But the point is, the duty of doing ijtihad is characteristic particularly of Sunni ethical thought. That's what distinguishes it from other madhahib in early Islam.